half a century before the great space race between the United States and the Soviet Union was the age of competitive discovery for the polar regions. I'm your host, Leah.
I'm Phil.
And I'm Steve, and today we're going to learn about two brave men who led the first expeditions to reach the South Pole.
If you have an appetite for the strange and bizarre, then pull up a chair and grab a spoon for another intriguing serving of Remnant Stew. Remnant Stew is gluten-free, organic, made from all natural, free-range ingredients, and guaranteed to provide the recommended daily serving of curiosity.
Many years ago, when I first began teaching, I can remember showing my geography class a 16-millimeter film narrated by the actor Anthony Quinn about the 1911 race to the South Pole between the Norwegian Roald Amundsen and the Englishman Robert Falcon Scott. My interest in this story was rekindled this past September when I visited the Fram Museum, which is located in Oslo, Norway. The Fram, spelled F-R-A-M, was a ship that was utilized in polar exploration from the 1890s well into the 19-teens. The ship is on display in the museum, and tourists are free to walk about and even below its beautiful wooden decks.
That would be so cool.
It was. It was really neat to see. The word Fram is Norwegian for forward, which is an appropriate name for a ship. The museum has steeply pitched walls, angling like an A-frame over the ship. Video projections of rough seas shown on the walls give tourists the ship's deck the feeling of being in an actual storm. The sides like roll back and forth. It doesn't really move, but you feel like it's moving by the projection
that
on
would
the
make
side.
Me. I wonder how many people have thrown up right there.
You have to hold on to something.
Clean up off the bow.
Swab the decks.
The Fram was first utilized by the Norwegian explorer, I love this name, Fridtjof Nansen. Fridtjof, F-R-I-D-J-O-F. No, F-R-I-D-T-J-O-F. Fridtjof Nansen, who attempted to sail to the North Pole in 1893. He came close, reaching almost to the 86-degree north latitude. The North Pole is at 90 degrees north, but he could get no further due to Arctic ice. The Fram was utilized in further Arctic exploration. In fact, Nansen was the first person to trek all the way across Greenland. But then later, Roald Amundsen took the Fram to Antarctica in 1911. The Fram is believed to have traveled further north and further south than any other ship before or even since that time.
Wow.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, the 1890s and early 1900s came to be known as the last great era of Earth exploration. All of the other continents had been explored, charted, and written about in great detail. All that were left were the polar regions. I'm having a hard time talking today. There was a great urgency among the era's explorers and scientists to gobble up one of the few remaining firsts. Both Amundsen and Scott were members of previous polar explorations. Now, how do you say his first name?
Roald.
Roald?
Yeah.
Amundsen was born in Norway in 1872 to a family of merchant mariners. He grew up loving the sea, but he was also an excellent cross-country skier. In 1897, at the age of 25, Amundsen joined what was considered to be the first Antarctic exploration. Led by the Belgian explorer Adrien de Gerlache, this was the first expedition to winter over in Antarctica. In Antarctica. And what that means is that they stayed there throughout the winter months in which they could have, no airplanes, no boats or anything could make it to them.
So June through August.
I think the ship actually had to leave them there and sail up to a warmer place and come back when it was warmer the following summer. So they actually wintered over, kind of stuck there.
Yeah, isolated there.
You're it.
Yeah.
Amundsen later wrote that this expedition was likely saved from scurvy by Dr. Frederick Cook, who hunted animals and fed the crew fresh, uncooked meat, which contains enough vitamins to stave off scurvy. Citrus was not available. So, we talked about that in our Yo-Ho-Ho episode. Scurvy was a really big deal among sailors. You had to have that vegetables and specifically citrus to not get it. Amundsen remembered this for his future expeditions. Then in 1903 through 1906, Amundsen led the first successful navigation of the Northwest Passage, traveling from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the Canadian islands. During this time, Amundsen learned more Arctic survival skills from the local Inuit tribe. Specifically, he learned the value of using sled dogs for hauling gear. He also learned that wearing animal skins and furs was far superior in extreme cold to the woolen parkas that he and his crew wore. The parkas couldn't keep out the cold when they got wet.
Right. You had to soak it up.
Right. The Inuit knew how to do this. They wore multiple layers of loose-fitting skins and furs, which allowed for air circulation and prevented sweating.
And that's really important. I think, in that extreme climate, you think, how could you sweat? But if you have too many tight clothing on, you will sweat, and then that sweat freezes and you can get hypothermia just from your own sweat.
Yeah. In 1905, Amundsen stopped in Nome, Alaska, and received the news by telegram that Norway had just separated from Sweden and was now its own country. Yay. Amundsen cabled a message of congratulations to his new king, Håkon the Seventh, and stated that his traverse of the Northwest Passage was a great achievement for the young country.
Yeah, brand new country, and we've already got a scientific achievement.
That's right.
Right.
Ding, ding.
All right, so now let's learn about the other gentleman, Robert Falcon Scott. He was born in 1868, making him just 4 years older than Amundsen. Coming from a British family with a long military tradition, Scott began his naval career in 1881 as a 13-year-old cadet. Wow. Set him off pretty young. 6 years later, Scott was involved in a cutter race in the British West Indies. Upon winning the race, he was introduced to Clements Markham, who was secretary of the Royal Geographic Society. Markham was always on the lookout for talented young naval officers to potentially lead a polar exploration. 12 years later, in 1899, Scott was selected by Markham to lead an Antarctic expedition called Discovery, which was financed by the Royal Geographic Society, known from hereafter as the RGS. Discovery departed England in August 1901 with a crew of 50. Unfortunately, only a couple of the crew had any experience in polar exploration, and little specialized training was offered before departing. Scott was a man who prided himself on his ability to improvise to meet the needs that arose.
Oh.
Yeah. Planning ahead? What's that?
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't quite that bad, but that was kind of his mindset that we can figure it out when we get there. His insistence on Royal Navy formalities didn't sit well with many of the merchant marine crew. Upon arriving in Antarctica in December of 1901, the crew set up a base camp which largely consisted of reinforced tents. In March of 1902, one member died from slipping over an icy cliff. Several members of the crew also developed scurvy. In an attempt to penetrate as far south as possible, Scott, along with Ernest Shackleton and Edward Wilson, made it to just beyond the 82nd parallel.
Wow.
However, Shackleton was taken ill on the return leg and left the expedition along with several other crew members on an early relief ship. The rest of the Discovery expedition wintered over for 2 years and returned to England in September of 1904. The Discovery expedition had caught the public's imagination, and Scott became a popular hero. King Edward VII promoted him to Commander of the Royal Victorian Order. Oh, wow. Scott and Shackleton would become rivals in future years, as Shackleton was selected to lead the next RGS Antarctic expedition in 1907, in which he reached the 88th parallel, only 112 miles from the South Pole. Meanwhile, in 1908 and 1909, two Americans named Frederick Cook and Robert Peary, and yes, that was the same Frederick Cook that Amundsen mentioned on that earlier expedition, the Doctor. Well, both of these men claimed to have led expeditions that reached the North Pole. Now, since that time, both claims have been disputed and discredited considerably, but at the time, they set off a frenzy of urgency among explorers, including Amundsen and Scott, as now only one great unexplored conquest remained, the South Pole. This became known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Amundsen and Scott weren't alone in their quest. Expeditions from Germany, France, Spain, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand were also planned. After Shackleton's return to England in 1908, Scott went into full persuasion mode. He badly wanted to lead the next Antarctic expedition. In his 1909 prospectus to the RGS, Scott wrote, quote, "The main objective is to reach the South Pole and to secure for the British Empire the honor of this achievement." A key element of Scott's plan was to utilize new motorized sledges, the forerunners of the modern snowmobile, which were in their infancy in development at the time. As a backup, he would bring horses along as well as some dogs. But he was concerned that these means of conveyance would not be able to ascend the polar plateau. The South Pole is actually on a top of a pretty large plateau, and you have to go up a considerable ridge to get to it. So he figured that he would have to use men to actually haul the sleds themselves once they reached that plateau near the South Pole. The Royal Geographic Society was impressed by Scott's plan, and he was selected to lead the Terra Nova expedition, which would launch in 1910. He selected a crew of 50 men. Again, most had no experience in polar exploration, and some had never even seen snow before.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Well, let's just take a break and talk about, like, how neat would it be to be alive at that time and to read all of these, all these great explorers and their adventures and things like that. That just, it seems so cool to be alive and when these people are, and I guess we still don't have, I mean, we're still doing the space thing, the final frontier, as well as oceans.
These are more tangible, goals, I think, that people can understand.
Yeah, the going to Mars thing is kind of cool. It's that
that takes forever.
It's going to be
it's going to be way out there.
Run.
Right.
Well, to bring some perspective to all of this, let's just talk about Antarctica for a second.
All righty.
Antarctica is the highest, driest, coldest, and windiest continent on Earth, and it is a continent. Mm-hmm. It does have land mass, whereas the North Pole is located on just ice.
Right.
Antarctica covers 14.2 million square kilometers. That's about 5.5 million square miles. The Antarctica ice sheet is the largest ice store on Earth and covers an area of 5.4 million square miles, or 14 million kilometers.
A lot of ice.
Wow.
Antarctica holds most of the world's fresh water.
Right.
An incredible 60 to 90% of the world's fresh water is locked in Antarctica's vast ice sheet. In spite of this, Antarctica is considered to be a desert.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
It doesn't get a lot of precipitation.
Yeah, when we think
but
when we think of deserts, we think about hot, arid, sandy, dry places.
Right.
But actually, a desert is more about the lack of water than high temperature.
Right.
A desert is any region that receives very little annual precipitation, and less than half an inch of rain has fallen on Antarctica in the last 30 years.
Yeah, that's a dry place.
Wow.
Because of the lack of rain, the ice on the continent has taken an incredible 45 million years to grow to its current thickness.
Right.
That's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to our great race. Back in Norway, Amundsen had been working on plans for an expedition to the North Pole, okay?
North Pole, right.
And to explore the Arctic region. He had received government approval and permission to use the Fram for this purpose. The Fram actually belonged to the Norwegian government. Upon hearing about Cook and Perry, however, Amundsen decided to go to the South Pole instead. Only he didn't tell anybody. He didn't tell anybody about this change. He didn't tell his crew. He didn't tell the government, and he didn't tell his creditors.
Especially not his creditors.
Yeah, the people that were backing this trip.
Right.
It had been in his original plan to sail south from Norway. In his original plan to go to the North Pole, to sail south first through from Norway, go around South America, and then north through the Pacific and enter the Arctic through the Bering Straits. So nobody on the 19-man crew thought much about it when the Fram left the fjords and turned to warmer waters.
Except they didn't turn around.
Putting it at Madeira in Portugal, however, Amundsen cabled his backers in Norway that he was heading for the South Pole, not the North. Guess what?
Hey, we're out of here.
He also sent a cable to Scott. I am heading south. See you at the pole. And the race was on.
Yeah.
Scott was at a stop in Melbourne, Australia when he received the cable, but he thought it was a hoax. He's like, surely not.
Whatever.
He didn't take it seriously. Upon leaving Madeira, Amundsen announced to his crew the true destination of their objective. He must have been a good salesman because they all cheered wildly upon hearing the news.
Yeah.
While the two men, Scott and Amundsen, were from the same generation, they really couldn't have been more different.
Right.
Scott was steeped in British naval tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Amundsen's family owned a fleet of merchant ships, and he grew up valuing the practical side of nautical trade. Scott had never considered polar exploration until he was offered to lead the Discovery expedition when he was 32. Amundsen, like most Norwegians, was an excellent skier and grew up reading about Arctic expeditions.
Yeah, as a boy, I think he read stories about earlier explorers about that. He was always interested in it.
Scott highly valued pomp and tradition and could get caught up with micromanaging his crew. Amundsen was a practical leader and valued allowing his crew members space to do work on their own. Scott's Terra Nova had 50 crew members. Aboard the Fram with Amundsen, there were only 19 men.
Different styles, completely.
Yes,
Exactly.
absolutely. Two different teams of guys. Another area of their difference centered on their means of conveyance. Scott put great hope in those motorized sleds and considered the horses to be a reliable backup. He had some dogs along too, but Scott considered them to be vulgar.
Yes. Well, yeah, they would eat their own stuff.
Yeah.
If they got hungry.
I'm like, if you're on a ship, that's great.
Yeah.
There's less to
Right.
clean up.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, Amundsen had learned a great deal from the Inuit about how powerful and efficient dog sleds were. He had seen that in action.
Yeah, right.
He discovered that his men on skis could keep up with the pace of the dogs pulling heavy sleds without riding along and adding extra weight. Amundsen relied on dogs entirely. He didn't bring any horses or any other means of
He was
conveyance.
all in on the dogs.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, while Amundsen had learned from the Inuit people the effectiveness of animal skins and furs against the extreme cold weather, Scott, on the other hand, felt that only ignorant natives wrapped themselves in furs and skins. They were not qualified for civilized men. His men wore
boy.
wool and the latest that British textiles had to offer.
So you see, there's quite a difference in their approaches to this task of getting to the South Pole. Scott's ship, the Terra Nova, had a good head start on the Fram, but the Fram made good time upon leaving Madeira, Portugal. The Terra Nova then found itself stuck in sea ice for nearly 3 weeks before breaking free. Finally, on January 4th, 1911, the Terra Nova reached the Antarctic shore at a location called McMurdo Sound. Unloading began immediately as Scott's men had to haul supplies over a patch of sea ice to the campsite. Disaster struck right away as one of the motorized sledges broke through the ice and sank to the bottom of McMurdo Sound. Huts were soon constructed on what was thought to be solid ground but turned out to be ice, which began shifting. This caused the structures to be taken down and reassembled further inland. The huts were divided into 2 parts, one for the officers and gentlemen, and the other for the grunts.
Yep, that's
no
gonna
mingling.
go well.
Yeah. Just a couple of weeks after Scott's landing, Amundsen and the Fram docked at a location called the Bay of Whales on the Ross Ice Barrier. The prefabricated log house was erected about 2 miles from the water's edge. This meant that Fram's cargo had to be transported by dog sled. This time was used to teach dog sled driving to all the crew members. After being cooped up on the ship for several months, the dogs were frisky and eager to pull.
We're at it. Let's get over.
Soon after the log house was completed, a blizzard hit the area, causing an enormous snowdrift to pile up against one end of the house. But Amundsen saw this as an opportunity rather than a hindrance. The snowdrift was hollowed out and turned into a workshop for improving and repairing skis and sleds. I mean, that's very
ingenuity
innovative.
right there. Yeah.
Right. They even constructed a sauna inside of it. Amundsen called
Of course.
He called it, quote, working with nature, not against it, which, if you're going to do this,
Yeah.
Make the
you've
best
got
of
to
it.
do it. Right.
Scott wanted to establish a second base in case something happened to the first, and he needed to relocate it. He sent several men on the Terra Nova to scout out a second location. On February 4th, 1911, the ship appeared in the Bay of Whales. The British were thunderstruck upon sighting the Fram and Amundsen's camp.
Oh, boy.
There's a great picture of this. I think we'll use this
Yes, we
on
have it.
our Facebook. They were not expecting the Norwegians to be there at all, much less seeing the highly efficient and orderly camp. Scott had not shared the cable that he had received in Melbourne with his crew. One of the British seamen wrote in his journal, quote, "It appears that Captain Amundsen is going to have a run for the pole, so it will prove a very exciting affair." He has dogs for sledge work, and all of his men are good on skis. The British guests were given a tour of the Fram, being notably filled with wonder by walking on the decks of the famous boat. They also observed the easy and precise manner in which Amundsen's men went about their task. In their minds, they were probably a bit envious, as their own camp was far from efficient. Amundsen invited them to set up camp near his, but feeling a bit miffed at his presence, the British returned to the Terra Nova and sailed off the same afternoon. This is the only time that the two expedition parties encountered each other.
Oh, boy. I mean, think of all the stories you've heard for, growing up in that era.
Right.
And they've heard of the Fram doing all of that under different captains and other pieces. And then to turn the corner in Antarctica, and there it is.
There it is.
There's this big piece of history.
And
They didn't even know it. Had no idea it was going to be there.
No idea. And then the captain's like, "Yeah, come on, we'll give you a tour.
Yeah.
We'll show you all around."
Yeah.
And then by the end of it, you're like, "Can I join your crew?"
Yeah.
We switched allegiances here.
We'll leave both boats here.
Yeah.
Well, now, if you've ever watched the Winter Olympics, you'll know that Norwegians score very well in Nordic skiing events,
Yeah.
frequently taking the gold medals. Norwegians are practically born on skis. This almost natural ability gave them the great advantage in the Antarctic. Amundsen wrote in his diary, quote, "Every day we had reason to praise our skis. We often asked each other where we would have been without these excellent devices. The answer is probably at the bottom of some crevasse or hole.
Mm-hmm.
Many a time we moved over parts so crevassed and broken that it would have been impossible to negotiate on foot. We need not elaborate on the advantage of skis in deep, loose snow," unquote. Amundsen's crew had a total of nearly 200 years of skiing experience, whereas Scott's crew only had about 5.
That's quite a difference, yeah.
Right?
Amundsen's plan was to utilize the few remaining days of the Antarctic summer, which is November to February, to drop supply depots as far south as possible, then wait out the winter months and began the push for the South Pole in the spring months of September and October. And I'm just overwhelmed by how long all of this was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, did these men have families waiting back home? And that
No,
No,
never
it's the adventure. I mean, seriously.
it is. I mean, it's just it's so
Some had
long
wives
just
and
to
children, yeah.
get
Yep.
to the ice over there, to Antarctica. I mean, I get frustrated on a 3-hour plane ride. The men and the dogs could utilize the food and supply deposits without having to carry everything with them. His goal was to drop a supply depot at 80 degrees south. The dog teams worked so well that they moved more than a ton of supplies 80 miles toward the pole and were back in their base in only 5 days.
Yeah,
Wow.
So everything was
quick
really
fishing.
efficient.
Yeah, they're going well.
Yeah. Over at the Scott camp, things weren't going so well. The remaining motor sledges that hadn't fallen through the ice proved to be useless. The fuel was freezing in the tanks, and the motors kept breaking down. Furthermore, his horses were clearly unprepared to work in the negative 20-degree weather. Also, they required tedious care. Each day, the horses had to be rubbed down and covered with blankets. Snow walls were built to shield them from the wind. For lack of snowshoes, the horses sank in snowdrift up to their bridles.
Oh, yeah.
By
for sure.
comparison, Amundsen's dogs trotted happily over the snow. In camp, they slept together and kept warm on their own and usually just took care of themselves. Scott did have some dogs, too, but only about 30, whereas Amundsen had more than 100.
Oh, my goodness.
Scott had also attempted to drop a supply depot, but he only made it about 60 miles, and it had taken 24 days. To make matters worse, several horses had died on the return trip when they fell through a crack in the ice.
So this is really turning out
Yeah.
Yeah.
for them.
The leadership styles of the two men were completely divergent. Amundsen shared his plans in full detail with his men. He was open to suggestions and prized each crew member's individual expertise. In fact, he had chosen them for their skills and personality. After the Fram had left Madeira, Portugal, he posted his entire plan on the ship's chart house so that each man could see his role, have time to study the operation, and know how their contribution fit into the overall function of the expedition. Amundsen intended to converge each man's talent in order to achieve a common goal. The first successful depot drop proved to everyone that his plan was working well. Scott, on the other hand, kept his plans to himself. He depended on the military tradition of blind obedience to orders. To him, any questions or suggestion was almost like mutiny. 2 members of his expedition were actually gentlemen citizens who had paid today's equivalent of about $100,000 each just to go along. They frequently confided to their diaries and to one another their concern about Scott's irrational orders to his crew. Oddly enough, Scott actually did have one Norwegian crewman who was brought along to teach the rest of the crew how to ski. But on the depot journey, this crewman found himself being ordered to leave his skis on the sled and lead a horse on foot. So it didn't seem like the orders always made sense.
Yeah. Well, bolstered by the success of the first depot run, Amundsen set out again on February 22nd to try to deposit more supplies along the route. He succeeded in making a depot at 81 and 82 degrees south, but it took a full month and 8 dogs had died as the weather was turning decidedly colder. The Antarctic winter was setting in. Utilizing their hollowed-out snowdrift, the crew went to work making improvements on their skis, sleds, tents, boots, and other equipment, while the dogs played away the winter in their tents, eating, sleeping, and breeding. Their masters kept busy working on equipment.
Over at the Scott winter camp, there was more of a leisurely atmosphere. Scott arranged for the various members of his crew to give after-dinner lectures on their various areas of expertise. One member, who was a photographer, had traveled extensively, spent many hours showing photos via a new invention called a lantern slide. And I think it may have been the first example of people being coerced into watching someone else's vacation photos.
I mean, what could they do? There wasn't any place to go.
Right. After midwinter, the grunts began working part-time, at least, on the sleds, getting them prepared for the push to the pole.
Well, now let's just talk a moment about the winter in Antarctica.
Right.
Of course, it's very brutal, and even if you have adequate shelter and plenty of supplies, the dark winter months are hard to get through.
Yeah.
We talked in our recent Psyche episode, and actually I think it was in the Leftovers stew,
Right.
After our theme music at the end, about we talked about winter over syndrome and how the isolation and lack of sunlight can really, I mean, it just wreaks havoc on the brain.
Mind.
Yeah. I found an article in the Los Angeles Times titled, quote, Antarctica scientist allegedly stabs colleague for spoiling the endings of books. This is a recent article.
Yeah.
I didn't put it here, but I think it was in 2018. And the attack was not fatal, but for whatever reason, one of the Russian this was a Russian scientific station. One of the Russian scientists took pleasure in finding out whatever book the other scientist was reading from the station's very limited library, okay? And would spoil the ending.
Oh, that's no good.
That's not the guy.
And I'm thinking if there's any reason for stabbing somebody, that would be it.
Justifiable. He had it coming.
And these scientists were both well-respected men in their 50s and had worked in the station for about 6 months together before the stabbing occurred. So this can happen.
I've had enough of you.
That's it. That's it.
But back to Amundsen and Scott. With no radio equipment, the two camps had no idea how each other were progressing. Amundsen didn't know that Scott's motor sleds were not working, and he imagined them just gliding along speedily while his dogs just trailed behind. So, I mean, it really started a fire in him.
Yeah.
It made him eager to start for the pole as soon as possible. The Antarctic winter nights lasted for 3.5 months until near the end of August when the sun finally faintly breaks the horizon. On September 8th, 1911, Amundsen and his men decided that they had waited long enough.
It's time to go.
The temperature had risen from negative 55 to negative 37 degrees Celsius. Warm enough.
It's a heat wave.
I know, right? But it was warm enough to make a start. I can't even imagine.
I'm already shaking.
Yeah, when my feet are cold, that's it. On the first day, things were going well. The dog sleds and men on skis covered more than 10 miles in less than 3 hours. I'm sorry, I keep wanting to call him Edmondson. It's Amundsen. Yeah. He wrote, quote, "The skiing has been brilliant today. I have rarely had such good skiing." The second day, they covered 13.5 miles, and all seemed well. The third day started off rough, though, as the dogs were so ready to rush that several of the dog teams crashed into each other, and some dogs broke loose, ran off, and had to be retrieved, which...
That's
I've done
deal.
that, and it took several hours to get them all back together and untangled. The rest of the day, though, went well, and the group covered more than 16 miles.
Wow.
On that same day, Scott was still preparing to leave his base. He wrote in his journal, quote, "I have tried to take every reasonable possibility of misfortune into consideration. and to so organize the parties as to be prepared to meet them. It is good to have arrived at a point where one can run over facts and figures again and again without detecting a flaw or foreseeing a difficulty. His plan was to strengthen his horses for a few more weeks, then begin the journey south.
That arrogance is just inviting fate.
Here it comes.
The following day, September 11th, Amundsen notes that the temperatures had dropped to negative 55.5 degrees Celsius, which is about negative 68 degrees Fahrenheit.
Negative 68. Can't even imagine, yeah.
He also notes that one of the sleds fell into a crevasse, but they were able to haul it out again. Quote, fog has formed so thickly around the sleds that sometimes we cannot see them. So the next day, Amundsen writes that the temperature hasn't warmed up and that the dogs are weakened by the cold. He made the decision to deposit their supplies at the first depot and then return to the base camp. Quote, to risk men and animals out of sheer obstinacy and to continue, just because we've started on our way, that would never occur to me. If we are to win this game, the pieces must be moved carefully. One false move and everything can be lost.
Oh, wow.
So he understood the enormity of this.
Right?
That night, instead of pitching their tents, they built igloos, which turned out to be considerably warmer. 2 days later, they dropped their supplies at the 80-degree depot and started back. The weather did not improve, and it took 3 more days to get back to their base. Several dogs died, and 3 of the men had badly frostbitten feet.
Oh.
The false start caused a good deal of grumbling along Amundsen's crew. One man named Johansen openly blamed Amundsen for his poor leadership. The cabin grew tense as Amundsen and Johansen spoke to one another in tense, clipped sentences. Amundsen then left the cabin and walked alone in the cold darkness. Returning later in the day, he announced that Johansen would not be joining in the pole expedition, but would partake in a side mission. Johansen looked to the others for support, but no one gave him any. All the team had agreed to the early start, and all knew that Amundsen was the only one to lead them if the mission was going to be successful. Johansen withdrew quietly. And so, it's all happening on land, but really this is just like a ship. That's mutiny.
Yeah.
That's mutiny, and it can't get out of.
You're all alone in your own space. It's just like that.
His diary, he further noted that it was had he come to him quietly, it would have been one thing, but he spoke so that everybody else could hear.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it was kind of trying to incite the rest of the team.
While this false start was costly, it wasn't without merit. They had gained survival experience and had managed to leave more supplies at the first depot. Meanwhile, Scott had taken off on a side mission to explore potential mineral resources of Antarctica. Part of his Royal Geographic Society charter was to conduct scientific exploration. He and 2 men set out on foot to locate rumored mineral deposits near the coast. They spent the last 2 weeks of September walking about in waist-deep snow, at one point nearly perishing in a blizzard, but found little in the way of mineral deposits.
Rather than attempting to deposit more supplies along the route, Scott opted to spend the first parts of October attempting to rework the motor sleds and also to increase the horses' feed to help them gain strength. He writes extensively in his diary about one horse in particular who bites and kicks severely whenever an attempt is made to harness it to a sled. Scott's crew did manage to establish a second base camp some 15 miles from the first. Even more impressive, they managed to string a telephone wire between the 2 huts in order to speed communication. Oh, wow. And this was really an important one of those scientific experiments that they were chartered to do by the RGS, and that actually turned out to be a very useful development in World War I, which broke out just 3 years after this expedition. Those same phones were then used along the lines by the troops in World War I.
Huh. Well, Amundsen and his men hoped to make a second start on October 15th. However, the weather conditions remained cold and stormy. Finally, on October 20th, the weather had improved enough, negative 3 degrees Fahrenheit, which is positively warm,
right?
To make a new start. Amundsen wrote, quote, "At long last we managed to get off. We have 4 sleds with 13 dogs each. For some reason, we ran too far east and into an unknown maze of cracks and crevasses. Suddenly, a large piece of the surface fell away next to the sleds and exposed a gruesome abyss, big enough to swallow us all. Luckily, we were so far to the side that we were saved." That first day, they made 20 miles. Amundsen noted that the 5 men slept comfortably in their improved tent.
Yeah, they'd made some improvements on their tents from their false start earlier, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Man.
2 days later, they were traveling through a fog when suddenly the leading sled disappeared. 4 of the dogs fell into a hideous crevasse, which would have easily swallowed them and their cargo also if the driver had not managed to stop. It took about an hour and a half to pull the dogs and sleds out. They decided to stay until the fog lifted. When it did, they discovered they were in the middle of danger. Can you imagine this? This fog lifted. And Amundsen wrote, on closer investigation, it turned out that the terrain around us consisted entirely of crevasse after crevasse and enormous chasms.
Wow.
Oh,
So
my
carefully, they slowly made their way to more solid terrain. For the next several days, Amundsen's team made steady progress.
Oh, my goodness.
On October 27th, Scott wrote that he and his men left their primary base and made it to the advanced base some 15 miles away. The motor sleds were still going, but making very slow progress. The operators frequently had to make mechanical adjustments on the fly. He noted that they had a splendid cup of tea upon arrival. That night, there was a problem in the corral as the horses had begun fighting with one another.
Uh-oh.
And now for something completely off topic and off kilter. Brace yourself for the oddity du jour.
So today's oddity is going to be a short one, so we can get back to the Antarctica. Have you ever considered why aluminum foil is shiny on one side and dull on the other?
Yeah, I often thought about that.
And is there and which side are you supposed to cook with? The reason there's a difference in the surfaces of the foil has to do with the manufacturing process. Foil is, of course, very thin, with regular foil being 0.016 millimeters thick, and the heavy-duty stuff, the stuff I always buy, is typically not quite twice that, at 0.024 millimeters thick. It's the perfect thickness for household use, but too fragile to make it through the milling process. To create foil, aluminum is rolled between 2 rollers over and over, making it thinner each time until it reaches the desired thickness. But a single sheet of foil between 0.016 and 0.024 millimeters thick would break in this process. So the factory is actually, they mill 2 sheets at one time, stacked on top of each other. That's what accounts for the difference in the sides. The side of the foil sheet that comes into contact with the milling rollers comes out very shiny, close to being like a mirror, while the other side comes into contact with the other side that comes into contact with the other sheet of foil comes out much more dull. And as for cooking, there's no right or wrong, as they both conduct heat the same, but when making a tinfoil hat, the shiny side goes out.
Absolutely.
It's got to reflect the alien thought control waves.
Oh, that's right.
I got my info from today.com and the Now I Know email newsletter, except for the part about the tinfoil hat. That's just common sense.
I bet with all your boys, you probably had some foil pouch meals made over campfires somewhat, didn't you?
Not me.
Oh,
that would be their dad.
Oh, okay. Well.
Not me. And we're back.
Yay.
Dun, dun, dun.
Now, back to the race to the South Pole. Before we go any further, I'd like to stop for a minute and credit a book called Race to the South Pole that was written by Roland Huntford. Really an excellent book. I really enjoyed reading it. Mr. Huntford gives a great amount of background information about both Amundsen and Scott and their team members. He also includes large portions of both of their diaries, as well as the diary of one of Amundsen's crew, which has never been seen up until this book. I highly recommend the book as it goes into much greater detail than we were going to be able to do today. He proceeds chronologically day by day, showing what each man wrote on a specific day, and then he adds further clarification explaining their writings.
Oh, wow.
We've taken this long in this program just to get both men started on their race to the pole, so for the sake of brevity, we're going to skip ahead several weeks now.
Yeah. Well, by November 19th, Amundsen and his team had reached the foot of the Trans-Antarctic mountain range. To this point, they have fallen into a steady pace of traveling 4 to 6 hours a day, covering an average of 20 miles a day. Ascending the mountains, their pace slowed down as they had to double the dogs. In other words, 2 teams pull one sled to the top of a pass and then return for the other sled. Descending the other side of the pass can also be dangerous, as the dogs tend to want to go way too fast.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Speed. Keep a hand on the brake, I think. Keep
Exactly.
them from going into some crevice before you knew it. At the same time, Scott, having abandoned the motor sleds, is progressing at about 13 miles per day with his horses pulling their sleds, along with one dog sled team. His men are walking or skiing as best they can. Now, there is one unsavory part of both expeditions, when a dog or a horse became seriously injured, the animals were put down, and then the meat was prepared and eaten by the men and also eaten by the remaining dogs. This helped both teams stretch their supplies, but it was the source of some criticism by the reading public in the years to come. Now, they had eaten their dogs and eaten their horses.
Wow. I can imagine. I mean, you do what you have to do, but right. I can see where they would come under a lot of scrutiny for that. By December 8th, Amundsen and his team have endured several days of intense fog and were able to move only a few miles per day. However, on this day, the sun broke through bright and clear. Using their sextants, they were able to determine that they were now at 88.25 degrees south latitude. They had passed the Englishman's Shackleton's mark from 1908, so they are the men. Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
A cheer went up and the Norwegian flag was unfurled and placed on the lead sled. Amundsen wrote, quote, "We had the best weather for a long time. Sunshine and almost calm. Temperature 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Extra chocolate was given to the men in honor of the occasion."
Take it.
Yeah.
On December 14th, Amundsen notes that they are at 88 degrees 45 minutes south. Quote, "Tomorrow, if all goes well, we will be at the South Pole. I feel like a boy again. My only wonder is, will we see a British flag when we arrive?" Because they have no idea.
They have no idea.
Yeah. At 3 p.m. the following afternoon, December 15th, 1911, a final check of their instruments proved that they had indeed reached 90 degrees south.
Oh, wow.
There was no sign of the British. Quote, "We are the first," exclaimed Amundsen. They planted the Norwegian flag at the South Pole and proclaimed the land to be King Haakon's the Seventh's land. "Thanks be to God," wrote Amundsen.
Yep.
The team spent 2 nights at the South Pole making detailed notes of the area. At the pole, they left an empty sled, a tent, the Norwegian flag, and a pennant marked Fram. At that moment, Scott and his team were still some 350 miles to the north, which anything's to the north.
Right.
Everything's to the north. Yeah.
But that's a long way, 350 miles off. Of course, the return trip could prove to be treacherous.
Yeah, you got to make it back.
The Antarctic summer sun doesn't set, but rather makes a circle of the horizon. Amundsen and his men traveled while the sun was at their backs so as to not be blinded by snow glare, that's very
makes
smart.
Sense. Yeah.
Again, they averaged about 20 miles per day. On January 25th, 1912, they reached their home base, which they had left 99 days before.
Gosh.
I know. I'm just still overwhelmed by how long this takes.
Yeah.
And anyway, and they haven't been home. They haven't been in their own beds. That's wow.
No, that's just,
Of the of the 52 dogs that began the trek, only 11 were left.
Oh, wow.
In total, the crew had traveled nearly 2,000 miles.
On dog sleds.
5 days later, Amundsen and his crew loaded the remaining dogs and the more valuable equipment on board the Fram and set sail. On March 7th, the Fram docked in Hobart, Tasmania. There, Amundsen cabled his brother and also King Haakon, informing them of his successful journey. He also learned that no word had been received from Scott.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, no.
On January 17th, Scott and his men were trudging forward, pulling their own sleds. Suddenly, one of his men spies a black spot on the horizon. Scott wrote in his diary, quote, "Soon we knew that it was a flag tied to a sledge, nearby the remains of a camp. Sledge tracks and ski tracks were going and coming, and a clear trace of dogs' paws, many dogs. This told us the whole story. The Norwegians had forestalled us and are the first to the pole. It is a terrible disappointment, and I am very sorry for my loyal companions." He consoled himself with the fact that it was still a great accomplishment, even if they weren't the first. Now for the run home and a desperate struggle to get the news through first. He thought maybe if he get home first, he could kind of control the narrative, at least, even though they were not the first to the pole. On January 19, Scott wrote, quote, "I'm afraid the return journey is going to be dreadfully tiring and monotonous."
Yeah, so they're really suffering from
right. And they're pulling their own sleds. So,
yeah.
On February 4th, one of Scott's team, Edgar Evans, suffered a serious fall. 2 weeks later, he fell again and died. The weather was dismal for the return journey, as it was getting later, more toward the winter. To make matters worse, when they reached their supply depots, there was a lack of cooking fuel to heat their camp stoves. On March 16th, another member of the team, named Oates, told his mates, quote, "I'm going outside the tent and maybe some time." He never returned. On March 19th, Scott and his 3 remaining men stopped at their final camp. During the next 9 days, with their supplies running low and with stormy weather prevailing outside, Scott and his 2 remaining companions wrote letters to their families. Scott made his last entry in his diary on March 29th, quote, "For God's sake, look after our people." It turned out that they were only 12 miles from a supply depot that had plenty of food and fuel to sustain them. The bodies were discovered by a search party the following November. Scott's diary and other records were retrieved. Next to their body lay several pounds of tree fossils which they had dug up. These were the first tree fossils ever recovered from Antarctica and proved that the continent had once been much warmer and likely connected to other continents. The tent was lowered over their bodies and a hill of snow was built over the site. A rough cross made of skis was placed on top of the mound. In his notes, Scott had written a, quote, "message to the public" that reads as follows. "We took risks. We knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint, but bow to the will of Providence. Determined still to do our best to the last. Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the hearts of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale, but surely a great rich country like ours will see that those who are dependent on us are properly provided for." The Terra Nova arrived in New Zealand on February 10th, 1913, and cabled the news about Scott's death. Overnight, Scott became a hero. Within a year, his diary became a bestseller. British school children were required to read it. A sense of national pride surged in the British Empire, which would carry them into the coming war.
My goodness.
When Amundsen returned from Antarctica, he was hailed as a national hero. The young country of Norway was bursting with pride over his accomplishments. Congratulations poured in from all over the world, including the former U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt, as well as England's King George. Even the British press was mostly kind to Amundsen, expressing admiration for his accomplishment, even though they were disappointed that their countrymen had not made it first. He gave lecture tours throughout Europe and the U.S. Even the Royal Geographical Society invited him to speak, though one member snidely proposed 3 cheers for the dogs.
But when the news arrived of Scott's death, the public mood changed. According to Roland Huntford, the author mentioned earlier, Amundsen the victor was eclipsed by Scott the martyr. In England, the narrative became that Scott, the upright gentleman, had been usurped by Amundsen, a mere glory-seeker who had behaved dishonorably in concealing his true intentions, had used dogs rather than honest man-hauling, and had then eaten those same dogs.
Ugh.
It was conveniently forgotten that Scott had also eaten his animals. This mythical narrative held firm throughout most of the 20th century. It wasn't until the 1980s that researchers began to categorize Scott as a heroic bungler, whose failure was largely the result of his own mistakes.
As for Amundsen, he did his best to justify his actions on the South Pole journey. For the most part, people outside the UK still honored him. He continued his involvement in polar exploration. After World War I ended, he led an expedition to retrace the Northwest Passage, only from west to east this time, and also to explore unknown areas of the Arctic Ocean. 2 members of his Antarctic expedition joined him in his new venture. Later in 1926, Amundsen took part in the first airship flight over the North Pole.
I think it was kind of like a blimp.
Some credit them as being the first people to reach the North Pole, and the works of Cook and Perry may have fallen into suspicion.
Yeah.
2 years later, on June 18, 1928, Amundsen died while flying on a rescue mission in the Arctic. It is assumed that the plane crashed in the Barents Sea and that Amundsen and his crew were killed in the accident. Their bodies were never found. Today in Antarctica, the Amundsen Scott International Research Station sits at the South Pole and hosts scientists and researchers from nations all around the world.
Wow.
There is no leftover stew today. Sources for the episode comes from wayfarertravels.com, from the Fromm Museum in Oslo, as well as a book called Race for the South Pole by Roland Huntford. We have not quoted anything directly other than quotes that came from Amundsen and Scott's personal diaries, which are both in public domain.
That's correct. Yeah, they were both very popular reads when they came back. Yeah.
And now it's time, boys and girls, for the Trivia Challenge.
Well, now it's time for the Trivia Challenge. You know how this works. Like and follow our Facebook page at Remnant Stew Podcast. Like and share this episode post. Put your answer to the Trivia Challenge question in the comments of that post. The first individual, the first individual to do all that will be the winner and will be mentioned in an upcoming episode of Remnant Stew. Our Trivia Challenge is also open to school kids, so if you're a teacher and your class listens to Remnant Stew, we challenge them to answer the Trivia Challenge. Send us the answer through the email at staycurious@remnantstew.com. If your class is first to answer, we'll send them a care package to the whole class. So, Leah, what is our Trivia Challenge today?
What board game is banned from the Soviet-Russian Antarctic stations after a 1959 disagreement escalated to murder involving an ice axe?
Ooh. Ouch. Wow, it's been quite a tale of Antarctic stories today.
Yeah.
Stabbings and murder.
Wow.
Hey, thanks for spending this time with us. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram at Remnant Stew Podcast. You can also send us an email to say hi or suggest a topic for a future episode to staycurious@remnantstew.com. We'd love to hear from you.
Remnant Stew is a part of Rook and Raven Ventures and is created by me, Leah Lamp. Dr. Stephen Meeker and I research, write, and host each episode, along with commentary by our audio producer, Philip Sinquefield. Theme music is by Kevin MacLeod, with voiceover by Morgan Hughes. Special thanks goes out to Brandy Nichols, Judy, Meeker, and Harbin, Gould.
Now, before you go, please hit the follow button so you won't miss an episode. Head on over to Apple Music and leave us a review. Share Remnant Stew with your friend, your family, that person with the icy stare. Until next time, remember to choose to be kind and always stay curious.